Okay, this is lesson 1.4. We're going to go back to the end of lesson 1.3. These were some of the answers that students came up with for different questions. For people who were finding it difficult to come up with their own question, here were some suggestions. So rather than having average age of population and number of game stops, they changed one thing. Changed game stops to Foot Locker. That's about as simple as you could make it. Some people did change other factors as well. Instead of saying average age, they said distance to the game stops, things like that. So there were other things, but you don't have to make this overly complicated when you're coming up with your question. And that's going to be important because you're going to be making your own question later today. The question about Netflix, the age of an actor who appears in a film, sorry, and the number of views of the movie. Some people decided to change this to things like the amount spent on the budget of the film. Good. It might be for an action film. Probably the more money that's spent on it, the more visually appealing it is. Therefore, you might be more likely to go to the cinema. So that was a really good question, I thought. And people were starting to use these word stems as well, using that word correlation within there. You're interested in why certain people make more money or less money than other people. So the person's age and the person's salary. Somebody also suggested what you do at work and how much money you get at work. Now, the problem with that is the first question. So if you ask me, what do I do at work? I'm going to say teacher, but you can't plot teacher as a physical number. So you'd have to think of another way around that problem. Some people did say how many jobs you have. That might be a good way of doing that as well. Perhaps if you have more jobs, you get more money. That's probably why you do those extra jobs. So that might be a good way of getting around that question as well. Is there a correlation between your work ethic and how much money you get at work? Once again, very good, but once again, difficult. I work really hard. It's not a number, so you might have to go back to that target question. How hard do you work on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the hardest and 1 being the laziest? So we got to think about when we're doing our questions and make sure that those answers are numbers. And if not, we got to rephrase it to make sure that we do get numbers. TikTok, oh my gosh, there were so many for this one. You guys thought of lots of different things. People talked about shares, likes, number of followers, if the topic's trending, length of video. There was a lot of different answers for this one. And for that reason, this will be the one that we'll start with next year first, because people found that one the easiest to do. And then perhaps we'll go into those ones that require a little bit more thought later. The correlation was between the average income of an area around a dog shelter and the average length the dog stays in a shelter. And the new questions people came up with, people talked about the size of the dog and how likely it is to get adopted. I think by how likely it is to get adopted, once again, you'd have to say how many weeks is it since it's been in the shelter. But yeah, perhaps if it's a big dog, if you're in an area with small houses, perhaps that's going to make a difference. If you got an area with a lot of land, that might be why you want a big dog where it can run around. But all good questions. And I particularly like this one, the age of a dog and how likely it is to get adopted. People always are kind of like the puppy that's super cute and very young, but perhaps that older dog that's got some issues, it's got some medical concerns, perhaps might not live as long. That might not be one that's going to be as well as quickly adopted. And I thought that was also a great question. Remember at this stage, we're not looking to see if that is true, but it's something that we might test to see if it's true using that data cycle. And for shoes, is there a correlation between the number of shoes sold in the second year compared to the first year? Sure, that brand new shoe might be super popular, but by the second year, perhaps there's a newer shoe that's come out that people are interested in. So good question for that one. And is there a correlation between the number of endorsements a shoe has and the number of shoes it sells as well? So you could perhaps look at number of commercials or things like that, or number of people who represent that company that sells those shoes as well. So some really good answers that people came up with, but I know people did find that very difficult because it's not really what we're used to doing. Now, we're going to look at one more of those pattern pictures again. So this one was building a fence. So the instructions I had to give at the start was to explain this in terms of this is 1, 2, 3, 4. And then for each one, we're just adding in another fence post, and we're adding in 2 more slats going across here. So this is a one big piece. This is actually 2 separate pieces here. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So certainly figure 1 has 4 sticks. Figure 2 certainly has 7 sticks. Oops. And then you would have to draw your own. So instead of having those 3, I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger, and I'm going to put in 4. And then between each one, I can see that there's like 2 bars here. So I'm going to need to do the same on each of mine. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. This is just for the purposes of counting. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, for the issues of time, and just so you can Practice this yourself. You should try to make sure you can complete the fourth picture, and you should get 13 sticks. Now, before I actually even start this one, I should be able to tell that this is linear, just because I'm going up by 3, going up by 3, going up by 3. Also, to practice some of the vocabulary again, this was the x-axis, so this would be an independent variable. This is the y-axis, so this would be the dependent variable. The number of sticks depends, that's why it's dependent, on which figure I'm picking. So if I'm picking figure 5, I need those 5 slats, but I'm also getting 5 posts, but I would need more slats. So the number of sticks will depend on the figure that I'm actually choosing for this question. Oh, this is one of those little graph questions where we're just trying to interpret what we notice. Olivia recorded assists and points for her basketball games. Based on the data, she says that players that score more points have fewer assists. Which graph matches this story? Now, you might want to pause the video so you can think. And a lot of people for this one, a lot of people ignored A because they knew that there was some connection here, whereas this is the no correlation one. But a lot of people picked this was actually B. And they thought it was because, look, one thing's going up, and therefore that meant there's a connection. That means there's a positive connection, or positive correlation. We can also have a negative correlation as well. So it's not quite as simple as that. So what it says here is, as they score more points, they have fewer assists. So if it would have said more points and more assists, that's both in the same direction. And it would have been fewer points and fewer assists. That's actually graph B. So as these are opposites to each other, that's actually why this is a negative correlation. And the correct answer is C. Now, you can actually see that better as well if we find somebody who had lots of points. Now, one very good comment was, it doesn't say which is which on the picture. It does not. So we're not sure actually which is which. So we'll go with, I think we want to think the number of points is going to depend on the number of assists that we have. So assists, we'll say, is the independent variable, the x-axis, and then the points is going to be the dependent variable. So somebody with more points would actually be somebody like this. And if I look on this picture here, you can see that they have very few assists. It looks like 2. Whereas if I look on this picture, somebody with more points, you can see is actually having a lot more assists as well, which is another good reason why it's not answer B. So I think a lot of students weren't familiar with this to begin with, the idea of if they both say more and more or fewer and fewer, that would actually be the graph of B. But if they're opposites of each other, that's where that inverse connection comes in. That's where we get that negative correlation. So more points and fewer assists, without even looking at the scales, I can actually tell that that one's going to be negative correlation. Oh, this was a couple of bonus questions at the end for people who finished early, so we'll skip on and we'll get to our question. So today, it's basically a completion of everything we've done in the whole unit, and this is really the last lesson in the unit, except for the quiz. Today, asking your own question, collecting data, organizing data, and communicating results. And this also requires a little bit of research as well, which is something that's very different from what we normally do. And this is really going to take up the whole lesson today. So after our warm-up, this was literally all we spent our time on. Now, I introduced something called a mini investigation called Goal. And we talked about some soccer results, and we talked about things like you could look at the score at the end of the game, you could look at the score at halftime, you could look at the number of goal scorers or how many goals were scored, etc., etc. Now, this was really just from, I picked soccer because obviously I'm an English person. I love my football, as I call it in England. So I picked that one, but figured most people probably aren't as interested in that, which left us open to discuss some of the other sports. So you can discuss this if people wanted to, but we tried to convince them that they might want to pick something else. And if you do want to pick soccer, you might want to pick a different country as well. We know we have a lot of people who liked La Liga. We had people, fans who were Real Madrid and Barcelona. We had people who followed their national team as well, wanted to look at their results. With the Copa America being fairly recently at the time of recording, people wanted to look at that as well. And there were other sports too. So we talked about, like, if you're doing NFL, what might be interesting. So we talked about passing yards, receiving yards, number of touchdowns, number of points, number of field, a lot of different things you can compare. But normally people want to make sure you choose 2 things that are comparable. So if you're picking something like receiving yards, that's related to the wide receiver. You would probably want to pick another stat that relates to that. You wouldn't want to look at number of runs they made, possibly, because that would be more of a stat for a running back. Or if you're looking at quarterbacks, you might want to look at how many interceptions they have, and then perhaps look at the number of sacks that they have as well, because they're both stats for the same type of thing. Basketball, we had a lot of basketball fans. Some people wanted to look at individual players. Some people wanted to look at individual teams. But we certainly talked about, like in the warm-up there, assists, points, turnovers, steals, blocks, points per game, free throws missed, free throws made, a lot of different things that you could possibly look at just to see if there was a connection there. For Major League Baseball, hits, home runs, steals, doubles, triples, singles, catches, fielding percentage. For pitchers, you might want to look at strikeouts. You might want to look at how many balls and strikes they throw in a game. Lots of different things you can look at, but same sort of thing. If you're picking something for a batter, make sure you pick 2 batting statistics. And if you're looking at pitcher, find something that's 2 pitching statistics as well. And for our hockey fans, you could also have goals and assists as well. You could have checks, you could have fouls committed, and quite a few other things. We also had people who were looking at softball. We had people who looked at volleyball. We had people who looked at boxing. People were very creative with this, and that was kind of why we wanted to do this. We wanted to pick something that would be interesting for you guys, a favorite sport, or something you could look at. One person actually even looked at video games because they said they didn't like sports, and we're like, that's fine. All you're trying to do is think of a question, see if you can find out the answer to that question by looking at the data. Now, there is certain problems with plotting data values. So for my soccer, I actually went from 0 to 10, 0 to 6, because that was the most number of goals, I think, in any game. If I'm looking at football, you might easily have somebody who scores 50 points in a game. And if I plot 0, 50, you can see on my graph, I don't see that. So that can be a problem. So we do need to know how to change the axes. So if we click on the graph settings on the side here, and I'm going to have to move myself out of the way again, you can change these values. So you can see 0 to 10 is basically here. I can change that up to whatever I like. I see my first number is actually 6, so I'm going to leave that one alone. And my second one, it says 50. I probably want to go above 50, so let me go 60. And then, whoops, let me try and type in 60. And look, now you can see this point here. You can see that it's level with 6. You can see it's level with 50. And that's going to be important later because we're looking for those particular types of correlation. And that's when the assignment started. So the assignment for 1.4 was you had to think about what sport did you want to look at, what 2 attributes did you want to compare, and then you had to go look for those data. Mainly people using internet, people using search engines, Google, people going to ESPN. Some people went to the college website looking for a particular team. However you want to do it, but basically you just have to say where you got it from, or if you got it from a newspaper, probably less likely now. It's probably more likely to be from the internet. And then we asked you to think about a prediction, but it didn't really matter if you were wrong. The important thing was finding the answer to that question. You then had to retype that data into here so it would draw the picture. And then from here, once you looked at your picture, you could use those definitions of positive correlation, negative correlation, or no correlation. I don't think we had any quadratic data that was that U-shape. So it was really more one of those 3 cases. And for people who did finish early, I once again recommended people spend a little bit longer looking at the dependent independent variables. Some people found that difficult, me included, having not done it for 20 years. I know I got a couple of questions wrong to begin with. And then once I practiced again, it was like, oh, yeah, I remember how to do this now. So that was one of the other things we recommended. But that was the end of lesson 1.4. A lot of time was for the students to collect data. And that's what you might spend the majority of your time on to begin with. Don't spend too long thinking about a particular one. Once you find your sport, pick 2 statistics, go ahead and start collecting that data and then plot them. Otherwise, people sometimes were still picking which ones they wanted to choose after 30 minutes, which was not really the idea of this exercise. And that's the end for this video.